the slides on the screen. Whenever you can just confirm.
Yeah, we can see the screen.
And now, so we will start 6:30. So I think last time we discussed about fraud, definition of fraud, the fraud triangle, symptoms of fraud, red flags related to fraud. So today we have to talk about, to a certain extent, how fraud investigation is carried out. You can call it a fraud investigation or a forensic audit. Now, if you look at a investigation or a forensic audit, as in the case of audits, external audits or internal audits, you have to have some sort of a plan, and it must be well thought out. At least 10 to 15 to 20% of your time, the entire work that you will put into a forensic audit, you have to spend at least 10 to 20% of the time on planning. If you get the planning wrong, then you might miss out on certain aspects and you will not be able to achieve the goals of an investigation. Before you formulate your investigation team, of course, there is a requirement that you ensure that all the members in your team are independent and there are no conflicts of interest in terms of those who are in terms of the auditee. So company that you're auditing, or staff, or director, shareholders of the company, you're auditing to ensure that there are no material, professional, or business relationships that may impair the independence of the forensic auditor. So you will have a declaration that needs to be made at the outset, and then you will, once that is done, you can commence your forensic audit planning. So when a forensic audit is done, when the word forensic is used, it generally means that the report that you provide will be used for purposes of litigation in a court of law. And to that standard, you have to ensure that the planning, the evidence gathering, and the presentation is done so that whatever evidence that you gather throughout the audit will be accepted or admissible in a court of law. So this is very, very important. When you start an investigation, you have to assume that litigation will follow. And why you do a forensic audit is because of various reasons. Companies that get an investigation done generally want to find out whether a fraud has occurred or not. Right? That is the primary goal. Has a fraud occurred? So you have to have an answer for that. For how long has the fraud occurred? That's the duration of the fraud. What was the mode of operation of the fraud? How was the fraud carried out? Who was involved in the fraud? Was it one person? Or was it many people? Can you hear what I'm saying? Because the screen is a little.
Yes. Can hear you.
You can hear. No, I'll just switch off the
Screen
the video.
Sir, if you can, sir, if you can increase the volume a little bit, it would be better, sir, because can hear you, but not that clear, sir.
Right. Okay. Just give me a second. Hold on. Okay. How is it now? Is it better or?
Now better, sir.
Right. So I'll speak a little louder. So the directors, when they tell you to do a forensic audit, they want to know who was involved. Is it one person or is it many people involved in it? What were their roles? To what extent do you have evidence to prove that they carried out a fraud? To what extent can a case be filed? I mean, at the end of the day, a forensic audit or investigation is all about gathering evidence which can be used in a court of law. Right now, steps that a company would take after a forensic audit report is issued, there are many kinds of action that the management could take. Sometimes it's just internal action where they discipline the fellow or terminate the fraudster or go in for a settlement. But then there are companies that file a case and put some sort of pressure and then try to get the person to settle and withdraw the case. And there are companies that go all out. The quantum of the fraud is very high. Since the cost of litigation is also high and there's a lot of time that you need to invest when you go in for a court case, you also have to ensure that it's worth the while, you know. And to that extent, you have to give advice to the management whether to go ahead with a court case or not. So who committed the fraud? How was the fraud done? For how long has the fraud gone on? What sort of evidence do you have? Who is involved in the fraud? How was the fraud concealed? What recommendations can the forensic auditor make to ensure that this sort of fraud does not occur again in the future? So you have to make recommendations. Of course, internal control weaknesses that come out or revealed through a forensic audit are generally not included in the forensic audit report itself, because it can go against, go against the company, because there are many control weaknesses. Then of course the defense lawyer on the other side will identify those and then try to get an acquittal based on all these deficiencies. For an example, if you say that your passwords are shared, if there's a collection and banking fraud, then that will go against you, But of course, you must remember that when you do a forensic audit, ethically, you must what you call disclose evidence, which is inculpatory evidence as well as exculpatory evidence. Inculpatory evidence means evidence that proves that a person has committed something wrong, but then again, there could be exculpatory evidence which proves that that person did not commit the fraud. So ideally, you have to give balanced, objective audit reports. You have to disclose both. I mean, if someone is killed, if Ishara kills Ashen in Colombo, but at the same time, if that is the allegation, but when you're investigating, if you see that Ishara was in Kandy through some CCTV camera, then you have to disclose that. You can't hide that information. That would be exculpatory evidence, which proves that Ishara did not kill Ashen. So in such a case, inculpatory as well as exculpatory evidence need to be disclosed. And quantification of the fraud also is very, very important. To file a case or go into a civil action or claim damages, you have to know the quantum of the fraud. It does not have to be an exact figure. It can be based on, sometimes you can give a range based on assumptions. But of course, you need to have the evidence for it. Then of course, the other thing that they want to know would be what caused the fraud. So generally, the causes would be lack of controls, lack of supervision, or lack of guidelines, lack of excessive trust, lack of segregation of duties. There are so many causes as to why maybe there could be behavioral aspects or reasons as to why the perpetrator financial difficulties. That is, of course, basically applying the fraud triangle, the motivations, the opportunity, and the rationalization that caused the fraud. So all that you can include in your investigation plan. So the investigation plan, as you can see, will have at the top a little bit of a background section. Background meaning why you're going ahead with this investigation, what led you to do this investigation. Perhaps the count was done and a variance was identified and the explanations were not satisfactory and a few alterations to documents were seen. There was cancellation of receipts, and this led the management to carry out initial inquiry, and then it was decided that a full-blown investigation needs to be carried out for a specific period. So that sort of preamble would be included in the investigation plan. And of course, you also have to have the investigation goals. Goals would mean why you are carrying out the investigation, what you're trying to achieve. Those goals would be quantification of the fraud as the fraud occurred. All those goals that I mentioned a few minutes ago, you will have to mention. Then what else do you have? You have a section for methodology or audit scope. We all know when we carry out a forensic audit, there are various, in terms of methodology, there's a process that is generally followed. I mean, we review documentation, then we carry out data analytics, we carry out personal interviews or interrogations, as they call it. Interrogations is a little more what you call adversarial, and trying to get an interview is to gather information, while an interrogation generally is to seek admission, where you try to get the suspect to admit that they committed the fraud. So you have plenty of interrogations being carried out, which generally results in a personal statement being given by the fraudster or the suspect or the person against whom the allegation was leveled. Then, of course, you also have digital forensics, sometimes mobile forensics, email forensics, computer forensics being carried out. Then you have undercover and surveillance activities. Then you might have a review or search, doing database searches in the register of companies to find out who owns companies, who are the directors, who are the shareholders. So it's very, very complicated. It's very, very complicated. And in the forensic audit methodology, those are some of the key activities that you need to carry out. There is physical verification of goods. There is observation, where you observe certain things. There's inspection of documents. There is recalculations, reperformances of certain controls. There's so many things that you need to keep in mind when you do. So in the audit scope section, and in the methodology that you follow methodology that is not there in this, of course, but I will just tell you. There is something called a fraud theory approach, where initially when there is some anomaly, within a day or two, the management will, at the level of the department, will go and check a few documents, speak to a few people, and try to figure out what happened and see what has happened and who is involved, and build a kind of a hypothesis. It's called the fraud theory approach, where you build a hypothesis and then you do the fraud investigation, you refine the hypothesis, and at the end, you know exactly what has happened. So that sort of thing also is followed in forensic audits, because at the start, you don't know exactly what has happened. You only know something, right? Based on initial 2-day, 3-day inquiry, you know what has happened to some extent, who is involved, how it was concealed. So based on that, so there is a initial gathering of data, documentation review, and speaking to people. And then you kind of formulate a hypothesis, that you start the investigation, you refine the hypothesis, then at the end, you know exactly what has happened. So that's a fraud theory approach, where there is hypothesis formulation, and then testing the hypothesis, and then at the end, kind of trying to develop a theory out of it as to exactly what has happened. So that fraud theory approach is one of the key aspects in fraud methodology. And the other aspect would be, when you're interviewing people, you always start from the periphery first and then get to the center. So you interview all the people first, other people, and then finally only you interview the suspect. You gather all the information and then you interview. So there is this thing about you start from general and then become specific. General to specific is also another feature of forensic methodology. And the other feature would be that you have to always assume that litigation will follow in a forensic audit. So then you have to plan the gathering of evidence. Evidence, as you can see on the screen itself, under point 4, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. There's so many places that you can gather information from. So all the information that you gather can end up as evidence. So you need to time stamp all this information, note it down as to how you got the information, who gave it to you, hard copy or soft copy format, when it was given, on what date. All that needs to be recorded in a kind of a log or inventory. So you have the audit scope in the investigation plan also will include what audit procedures need to be carried out. It can be those specific areas that I mentioned under documentation review, what documents you need to review, and what audit procedures you need to carry out. You can have interviewing of people, digital forensics, data analytics, research, going through research databases, undercover operations, surveillance, all that can be included in the audit scope. Audit scope includes not only the audit procedures that you need to do, but it will also include the period you have to cover and the area you have to cover. Perhaps commercial bank, all payments between January to March. That also is in the audit scope, right? And then sometimes in the investigation plan, you have to include a section where you have to mention whom you have to keep informed during the investigation, the audit committee, the police, the lawyers, the HR departments. You have to have that because you can't wait till the end of the investigation. There are periodic, reports that you may have to issue, progress reports or presentations that you have to do. So that is important. Whom should you keep informed? Then the gathering of evidence, the different sources of evidence, the cloud, from email, from data backups, from scanners, printers, all that is to be included in your investigation plan. And the team, who is in the team, there's specific roles. You might have a auditor, you might have a accountant, you might have a computer forensic specialist, you might have a data particular handwriting analysis expert, you might have a digital forensic expert. Like that, there will be several people, different skills. So the structure of the investigation team, the reporting lines, their responsibilities. Then you will have to have another section on the resourcing of it. What other resources do you need? What forensic audit tools, softwares are you going to use? Do you need scanners, printers, computers, laptops? That all that resource requirement, financial budget. Then you have a logistics, accommodation, traveling, all that. So all that is included in investigation plan, right? So investigation plan basically will have a Gantt chart also specifying what you will do first, what will you do later on. There's one person's input, maybe another person's output. So all that has to be properly sequenced. And the investigation plan would contain all that, right? The investigation should be coordinated with management, legal counsel, other specialists. Obviously, I mean, you have to keep the management involved, you have to keep the lawyers involved because they will be coordinating your visits to the CID and the police. And there will be other specialists also. I mean, HR specialists, you might have insurance specialists, might have IT specialists. All of them have to be kept informed. HR may be waiting for your report to file a charge sheet, to start a disciplinary process. Investigators need to be prudent, consistent, and knowledgeable of the rights of the person. This is very important because the person whom you're investigating against will also have rights, privacy rights, human rights. There will be certain labor laws, so you can't discriminate. You can't just suspend without pay. It might be a suspension with pay, and then at some point down the line, 1 month or 3 months, you may have to review or continue the suspension or terminate. So there is a process that has to be followed. And when you do a forensic audit, you have to ensure that the rights of the individual concerned, or the rights of the person against whom allegations have been made, that person also has certain rights, and you have to ensure that. That's why you get HR involved, you get your lawyer involved. I mean, sometimes it could be taking the personal laptop of an employee. I mean, can you just do that, or should you get a court order? There's so many things that you need to think about. The level and extent of complicity in the fraud throughout the organization needs to be assessed. I mean, one of the problems sometimes is that courts won't, you can't win a case if you do not have the original, right? So if a petty cash fraud or a payment fraud is carried out, if you can destroy the original, then it will be very difficult to provide any sort of evidence in a court of law to prove that a person has committed a fraud. So in such a situation, you have to protect the evidence, right? So for that, you need to plan the gathering of evidence and find out where could your evidence reside and quickly take steps to isolate that evidence so that the perpetrator or the fraudster cannot destroy that evidence. Maybe I think something like, putting your mobile phone to airplane mode, or it could be taking the laptop quickly, or it could be taking the vouchers and restricting the access of the fraudster to office. or maybe the removal of access rights. So all that you have to see, because the last thing we want is the destruction of crucial evidence. Obtaining misleading information from persons who may be involved. Yes, so there again, what they mean is, of course, you have to interview people and you have to gather evidence, and when you do a forensic audit, it's all factual findings based on evidence. You don't give opinions in a forensic audit. That's why sometimes calling it a forensic audit itself is wrong. It's forensic services, because if in an audit, generally you give a kind of an opinion. But nevertheless, there are certain employees who can mislead you. I mean, you interview the same person 3 times, there might be 3 different statements that they give. And then whatever evidence that you gather, you have to ensure that you secure it. And then the chain of custody must follow. Chain of custody is a documentation process where you log every piece of evidence that you get from the time you collect it from the crime scene to the point you submit it in court. You have to ensure that you maintain a log as to who handled it. So if I collect it and give it to Ishara, I will have a form till where I collected it, time, date, then handing over to Ishara, he'll sign, I'll sign, time, date. Then if I give it to Ashane, then from Ashane to Gishani. So every point you have to maintain a chain of custody. That's everyone who was in custody of that piece of evidence. You have to describe the evidence at the top. So you can Google chain of custody form and see what it looks like. So you have to, so for every key evidence, generally these are for physical evidence, guns and all that, but even for documents, you have to maintain, like in a court case, they might ask you 5 years later who gave this document to whom. So then you must know, no? So you will be able to remember. So maintaining the chain of custody being a log or a register or a form which documents from the time you collected, from where you collected your evidence, how you collected it, whom you gave it afterwards, to the point that it's submitted to courts, who was in custody of that piece of evidence, and then there cannot be a break in that chain. If for half an hour you can't prove where the evidence was, the judge will throw it out saying that the evidence may have been tampered with during that period. So it will be very, very careful, right? Chain of custody cannot be broken under any circumstances, and it must be held only by those who are authorized to hold it. If any authorized person has got it for some reason, person who should not kind of be in custody of that asset, then it's that piece of evidence might be thrown out, right? So to keep these things in mind. Interrogation of employees, this is of course a very vast subject, but they have one slide on this. So interrogation, when you, according to Sri Lankan law, if you do a cash count and you have a, let's say 200,000 variants shortage, and then you confront the cashier, and the cashier says, yes, I took it, and gives a personal statement, it's still not valid. Personal statements given by employees are not valid. It's only valid if it's given in a court of law to a magistrate. Personal statement saying I killed someone to a police officer is also not valid. So, but anyway, it's good to get a personal statement, because in the mind of a judge, it's a human after at the end of the day. So the judge will also wonder why that statement was given, but it cannot be used as evidence against you. But generally, what happens is you get a statement, nevertheless, highlighting certain things about the crime, about the fraud, and you get him to confess to it, how he did it, how he hid it, when dates, times, or trying to document everything in the personal statement that only he knows. The judge will also wonder, these are information that only the fraudster knows, and then it will be difficult for him to kind of later on retract that statement, right? But nevertheless, according to Sri Lankan law, only statements given to a magistrate are valid, because police officers, they will torch and get a statement out. So because of that risk, they get statements. I mean, they go to CID also and give statements, these fellows, but still they are not really valid, right? In terms of it cannot be held against you. But then again, the judge is human, and they'll also wonder. Because you can always say you were under stress, you were being interviewed or interrogated for 5 hours, you just want to get out of it. You were coerced, you were forced, so many things. But of course, there are things that you can do to ensure, to enhance the authenticity of that statement. Of course, that is not part of the syllabus, so I will not go there. In an interrogation, I mean, there are employees whom you interview during a forensic audit to gather information. You might speak to directors, you might speak to head of the department, you might speak to other accounts executives. The purpose of that is to gather information. You might speak to HR to gather information about the person, about the processes, about their SOPs, about what they saw. So those interviews are generally for information, gathering of information. So that sort of interaction is not called an interrogation. It's a more of an interview. But then again, if you interview the suspect, initially, it's very difficult. That would be an interrogation. I mean, generally what happens is you management will interview and get a personal statement, but later on when the forensic audit starts, the forensic auditor will also speak to him. But at some point, towards the closure of the engagement or the end of the forensic audit, you do a kind of initially you may have interviewed him, but you may not have had all the evidence with you. But when you go towards the end of the interview, you know how that person has committed the fraud. You know how the fraud was committed. You have evidence, all that. So then when you do the interview, it's an interrogation. And the objective of that would be, it's called an admission seeking interview. It's not just an informational interview. It's an admission seeking. That is, you try to get that person to admit that he committed the fraud. So initially, you will ask questions and this and that. He might say no. If he says no, you can say, no, I have evidence like this. It's your username that was used. See, your handwriting is here. And you kind of overwhelm with that person with the evidence. And then at some point, he will go silent and he will think, yes, I did it. So that is the objective. And then you slowly get that into a personal statement and get him to sign off on it. So that little bit you have to know. Initially, you have to start with, it's you have to build some sort of rapport with the person. You have to introduce yourself, and you have to tell him that you don't use big words like investigation and shortage. You say variance. You're doing a review. Use words which are not that incriminating or intimidating, and then build a rapport and slowly, chronologically ask what happened, how do you do it, and then slowly see what are the key points and get him to write it and sign off, or you can write it and he can sign off. But at the end of it, you have to, of course, say that he has to say, I am giving this personal statement out of my own free will. I know I don't have to give it, but I know what I'm giving it nevertheless. I know this could be used by me in a court of law, used by the company court of law, and all that nonsense you put at the end and get him to sign off. So generally in an interview, you must have two people from your side so that, you have a witness. If something goes wrong or whatever he says, you're a witness. He also can sign off as a witness in the personal statement. All that is helpful because you have to look at his, what you call verbal, what he says as well as his signs, his non-verbal signs also you have to monitor, because there are certain signs that a fraudster would make that will indicate that he's being deceitful or lying. So to pick up those and then modify your questions based on his, what you call, non-verbal signs, We'll document everything and then see how you want the personal statement to be recorded. So what you should gather in the personal statement are specifics related to the case. If he says, I did the fraud, then you must not stop there. Then you must ask, how did he do it? Where did he do it? How did he hide it? Those are things that only he knows. What was the motivation in doing? Did you have financial trouble? So if you can capture that in the statement, then it's very difficult for him to retract it later on. But anyway, it's not valid. Two persons should conduct it, one to take notes and one to serve as a witness. So one person asks the questions and observes, the other person takes down the notes. If one person needs to observe it. Another witness also, it's good to have two people. So there are open questions that you ask, questions like why, how. Those are questions to which answers cannot be given in a yes or no way. So can you describe your responsibilities? Can you tell me how you carried out your petty cash? process. So answers to how you did it, why you did it, what you did. So those are open questions. And there are certain questions the interrogator could ask, which are called closed questions. That is where the answer is yes or no. So you're telling me that you carried out the fraud at such a date. So you're telling me that it was done between March to July. Yes, no. So because once they explain, you need to get it confirmed, right? You need to get it confirmed. So then you can, what you call, paraphrase it, and then tell him, is that what you're saying? Where the answer is would be yes or no. So there are open questions as well as closed questions. Closed questions are important to confirm certain things, right? To get him to admit to certain things. So open questions are there, closed questions are there. Then there are questions which test his character also. That is not here. Yeah, so I don't need to explain that. Normal interviewing methods regarding non-threatening tone, you must be kind, you must not be trying to be intimidating, you can't force him, but you have to observe. When he's seated, you have to place him in a way where he's not on the other side of the table where you can't see his entire body. You must place him on the side so that you can observe his body language. That is very, very important. The employee should not be allowed to return to his or her normal work area upon completion of the interrogation. Yes, the best time would be to start in the morning. That's why all these people, MPs who go to the CID, will start in the morning so that you have good 5-6 hours to do the interrogation. Otherwise, if you tell the fellow to come at 3 o'clock, he'll be waiting to go at 4:30. And then after the interrogation, you can ask him to go because he'll be tired also. Because the employee is now alert to the fraud investigation, he might be tempted to destroy valuable evidence. Can you see that? Of course, to prevent him from destroying valuable evidence, what you do is you restrict his access to the work area as soon as you know that, as soon as you gather evidence that he's up to mischief. You can isolate his him. The chief audit executive is responsible for fraud reporting. Yes. So if the fraud investigations are carried out by staff under the chief audit executive, obviously that fraud investigation report has to be signed off by the chief audit executive. So sometimes you give oral presentations, sometimes you give in written oral presentations, or can have discussions, oral discussions. Sometimes it's written form, interim or progress reports or final reports. And those are the general ways of communicating the results of the fraud investigation. The formal communication may be used at the conclusion, the time frames. Yeah, so in any forensic audit report, you have certain sections. You have a background section, you have an executive summary, and then you have the audit scope or methodology section. In that section, what are the audit procedures you carried out? Who are the people you interviewed? What are the documents you reviewed? What are the specific audit procedures you carried out? All that is mentioned. And then you have your methodology audit scope. Then you have your factual findings, findings one by one. And then you have your conclusions. Conclusions generally will tell how much was, what the damage is, what's the loss, who is involved, and for each person who is involved, what evidence you have to prove that that person is involved. Conclusions can also, so conclusions generally tell whether the fraud has been committed or not, the period of the fraud, who is involved, the damage due to the fraud or the loss. Then you have why the fraud occurred, the modus operandi of the fraud, who is involved in the fraud. For each person involved, why you feel that person was involved, what was his role in the fraud. Some may be directly involved, some may be indirectly, and what evidence you have. And then sometimes you might give recommendations as to what sort of action should be taken, whether a court case should be filed, or it should be just a letter of caution, or a letter of reprimand, or a demotion, or whatever. You might make recommendations also on what sort of corrective action needs to be taken to improve the controls to prevent the recurrence of the fraud. So all that can be there. The conclusions will more or less, the executive summary and the conclusions will be to a certain extent similar, but the executive summary should be not more than 2 2 pages, and it should contain a brief overview. The executive summary should contain a brief overview of the entire fraud, where you give a little bit of the background, little bit of the scope, little bit of the key findings, the conclusions, the damage, the duration, those involved. So everything comes in the executive summary, right? It may be written to protect the identity of some of the people involved, or generally in a forensic audit report is confidential in nature, and you have to mention who is involved. The needs of the board and the management, legal requirements, policies, procedures should be considered. So when you speak to the lawyers, they may want certain things incorporated into the report, or they may want answers to certain questions. Non-compliances with policies and procedures of the company. The board will also have certain objectives of why they want the forensic audit done. The management will also want certain to find out certain things. So all those, the inputs must be obtained so that when you issue the report, all of their needs are met, as long as, of course, it falls within the normal scope of a forensic audit. A draft of the proposed final communication should be submitted to legal counsel for review. A draft to the lawyer first, and then once their feedback is also obtained, you can issue the final report. Any incident of significant fraud or incident that leads the internal auditors to question the level of trust based in one or more entity must be timely reported to senior management. So that's about, if you, when you do the forensic audit, you feel sometimes that one or more people are involved, that they have breached their trust, then of course, you shouldn't wait till the end of the report. In a progress report, you should give some indication as to who might be involved. So the management also can take timely action to prevent further loss or to prevent evidence from being destroyed. If previously issued financial statements have been, so that is a case where due to some frauds, and if that fraud has led to a misstatement or a material misstatement in the financial statements, then of course you have to see how the financial statements are also affected. Not all frauds lead to material misstatements in the financial statements, right? But if a fraud has led, maybe asset misappropriation fraud or bribery and corruption fraud has led to a misstatement in the financials, and that is material, you may have to just inform the board about that. Because the external audit opinions given on those years may have to be relooked at. Resolution of fraud incidences. Resolution means how it's resolved, right? Management and the board are responsible for resolving fraud incidents. You can't just let fraud incidents slip by or without investigation. So you have to provide closure to persons who are found innocent, no? To discipline the employee, you have to request voluntary financial restitution somewhere. You tell the employee, please settle. You may have to terminate sometimes if the fraud involves a supplier, terminate the contract. You have to report it to law enforcement. If it's a bank, you may have to report it to the central bank or the SEC. Filing a civil suit to recover the amount taken. Filing a civil suit to recover the amount taken. That's civil action. Sometimes you may have to file criminal action. Insurance claim. Sometimes to file insurance claim, you need to know what the damage is. That has to be done. So you have to keep the insurance providers informed while you're doing the audit. Complaining to the perpetrator's professional association. If you're a chartered accountant, you might be able to complain there. Ethics case. Recommending control improvements. Yes. Prevent recurrence of the fraud. Management or the board determines whether to inform parties outside the organization after consultation. Yes. So if you're going to inform anyone outside the outside the organization, you can't do it alone. You have to get the concurrence or the blessings of the management or the directors. Certain things, of course, if you're external auditor, you're empowered. There's a act called NOCLA. If there's any non-compliance with a regulation or a law, the auditors or anyone in the organization could first, as a first step, inform the management. If the management does not address it, they can wait for a little while and then inform the directors. If the directors don't address the non-compliance against the regulation, you can go to the regulator. So like that, there is a hierarchical way of where an accountant or an auditor or any employee for that matter could report to external people and be protected, right? provided they follow the process where they inform management, directors, and then if there is continuing and no action is taken, you can go beyond outside the organization and no one will be able to, though you will be breaching confidentiality in your contracts, you will be protected. Internal communications are a strategic tool used by the management. Yeah, so all that is important. That's about having a good code of ethics and code of conduct and communicating it to the staff. The internal auditor may be asked by the management or the board to express an opinion on internal controls related to fraud. So there are certain guidelines which we will cover later. You can read this practice guide formulating and expressing internal audit opinions. If you Google that, you can download that report and read it. And then there is a report. Of course, this one we'll cover in part 2. Number 2, you can, if you like, download the report and read. An opinion on fraud-related controls is acceptable, but it is inappropriate for an internal to express an opinion on the culpability of a fraud suspect. That is, when we do a forensic audit, we don't give an opinion, we only give factual findings. So we can't say, it's up to the courts to decide whether a person is guilty or not guilty. Right? What we give is factual findings. Based on the factual findings, we can say that this person has committed something, right? But don't go to say whether he's guilty or not. That's not your guilty or not is up to the courts. But of course, you can give an opinion as to whether a fraud has been committed based on your factual evidence who is involved. That you can give a conclusion, but you must not give it in the form of an opinion or talk about the guilt or not guilt factor of a person. Right? On the state of control, generally in a forensic audit report, we don't go to mention about controls. We give it in a separate report, right? Otherwise, that will cloud the investigation and maybe to the disadvantage of the company that is getting the forensic audit done. So then, do you have any questions before we move on to the next chapter? We have another presentation on controls. Would you like to ask me anything about a fraud investigation unit? You can ask. I'll give you what to.
Yeah, I think, regarding
Go ahead, Ishar.
regarding the conclusion part of the report, forensic report, Ashen, is it okay if we conclude it by saying according to the facts beyond reasonable doubt or like beyond reasonable doubt we can come to a conclusion that this person is still this person has carried out this particular fraudulent activity? Can we conclude it like that?
No, I don't think you should conclude it like that. What you can say is don't use the word beyond reasonable doubt. In a criminal case, the burden of proof is beyond reasonable doubt. Right? That's why when you look at films also, you see a jury of 12 people. And if one person in the jury says, no, he did not commit the murder, that person, the killer is free to go. In criminal cases, you have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. So that is something that occurs in a court of law. In a civil case, it's not beyond reasonable doubt. It's a kind of a probability. If it appears more than 50%, it's called preponderance of evidence. If it appears more than 50%, that based on the evidence that a person has committed something, in a civil case, you can find him guilty. In a criminal case, you have to prove beyond reasonable doubt. That means there cannot be even a slight doubt as to that he did not commit it, right? That he committed it. Slight doubt, if there is, you have to release it. So don't use the word beyond reasonable doubt. What you can say is based on the evidence that you collected, you can state that these two are involved in the fraud. You can use the word involved. But whether it's beyond reasonable doubt or based on preponderance evidence, that is up to the court to decide. So you have to be a little careful in your wording. You can say based on the evidence collected, Mr. So and so was involved in the fraud. That is what you feel based. That you can say. That's not an opinion. That's a conclusion. You're coming to a conclusion. But don't use the word beyond reasonable doubt. That is legal jargon. It is for the courts to decide in a criminal case. Any other questions?
Okay, thank you, Ashen.
Right. you have any questions, ask her. Would you like that? I also can come out with certain facts that you might be interested to the whole class. Ishan Pereira, any questions? Gishani, questions you have?
At which point the auditor cannot get involved? Or is there a point like that also?
In a fraud investigation.
Yeah,
Yeah, the
an
only
internal auditor. And I say it's an in-house internal auditor, I suppose you cannot,
Yeah.
right? It has to be an independent party.
Yeah. So it depends on the internal audit charter whether the internal audit department is authorized to carry out investigations. In some internal audit charters, the internal audit department is not authorized to carry out investigations, in which case all investigations are outsourced. But if the internal department is empowered to carry out investigations, then you need to have some sort of a Chinese wall within the department just to ensure that there is no impairment to independence. I mean, the last thing that you want is to do an audit for company in a particular department where you yourself is involved and you give a clean report, and then 5 months down the line, you are part of a team that is now carrying out an audit, a forensic audit of that department. Someone could say that you carrying out a forensic audit of a department where you carried out an internal audit. Or you were a member of that department in another capacity, your independence is impaired because there's a self-review threat. So there is no regulation which says that an internal auditor should not be involved in investigations, but you have to look at the conflicts to see whether your role in that is okay, and whether the defense lawyer can pick up on something and say, Gishani, have you carried out an audit of that department? And if you say yes, so when you carried it out, did you come across any frauds? Did you come across any internal? No, you have given a clean up, and now you say this has happened. So if are you saying that the audit at that time you had not carried out an effective internal audit, and they will try to impeach, that's the word, impeach your credibility, impeach your capability, and that will create a
So,
doubt in the mind of the judge that, your report is not very credible. So you have to
credible.
manage those, what you call impressions.
Yeah, and also if say okay, you have that independence, is it a report by such a internal audit division? Is it accepted by the CAT and all that?
Yeah, it's accepted. In most companies, it's the internal department that goes and gives the evidence. It's accepted. It's accepted. That's okay.
Right.
So you have a
Thank
common head. The head of the department goes. You can have a manager who is specifically doing investigations and kind of have a bit of a Chinese wall, where at least the junior people, the investigators are independent. The manager also will be independent, but the head oversees everything.
Mm.
So by having a different investigation lead, but in most cases where I also go, the internal auditor has already got to the CID and given their statements, and just because the internal auditor does it does not mean that his findings are not. Because sometimes what happens is it's through the internal audit that the fraud is initially detected. So then the internal audit gets converted or expanded into an investigation. It's like you do a cash count and then you suddenly find there is a shortage, and then you look into it, and then you do a small investigation or expansion of an internal audit. Because courts, they don't care whether it's a forensic audit or internal audit. They just want the evidence in the proper way. So if it's through an internal audit that you have detected it, as long as you've followed good forensic principles, that is sufficient. But now, of course, with this popularization of the words forensic audit or woharika viganane, they don't use the word investigation even, they just call it forensic audit. But I have seen internal audits also done, which have been done to the level of a forensic audit. And as long, because at the end of the day, it's all about evidence, no? It's all about accuracy of the report and evidence and the conclusions and, and the presentation of that. Because sometimes when forensic audits are done, management does not want to call it a forensic audit also. They are so, they want to be diplomatic, they don't want to show the employees that a forensic audit is done. So it's through a process review audit or a internal audit that the fraud is detected and then commented upon. So the objective is to collect the evidence in the right way, As long as you have a report for that will stand.
Right.
Any other questions?
Thank you.
Yeah, the forensic audit has its own objectives, With the internal audit, no one is going to ask you, has a fraud occurred? But the objective of a forensic audit is you have to tell whether a fraud has occurred or not. As soon as I go, I can remember I went to Mathura once, the crimes unit. As I said, the first question was, Nathana, is there a fraud here? Yes or no? Sometimes it's very difficult to say, because it becomes a fraud only if it has been done intentionally. So you have to get the evidence to prove that it was done intentionally, and there are many examples and instances of this. And based on the factual evidence, it's difficult to believe that this could have been an error or something which occurred due to negligence or recklessness. So be careful of all that. It's very easy actually. You don't know about this, but I'll just go through some of these slides. Let me put this into presentation now. Yeah, so flowcharts, we all know, these are some of the tools that we use in an internal audit. There is a chapter for this. And in this chapter, I will distribute this slide deck, hopefully tomorrow. So this chapter, I'll just quickly take you through the topics. You learn about flow charting. So about 4 or 5 slides on that. Then about certain accounting processes, segregation of duties, organizational structure, accounting cycles, roles of management, and so forth. Just give me a second. Different types of controls, so alternative definition of control, policies, procedures, personnel, accounting, budgeting, reporting. So this, of course, in my opinion, this is something that you can read on your own and understand given your experience and maturity. But nevertheless, I will just go through it. So at the exam, you might be asked about these tools that are used in an internal audit. I mean, most of the processes today are documented in the form of flowcharts. Flowcharts are graphical representations of how a process is carried out, who is involved in that process, what are the key internal controls, what are the documents that are input, processed and output, that come as output in those activities, how many copies of it are raised, whether the processes are manual processes or computerized processes, where the information is stored. Is it a database, electronic file, or is it in some manual document, box file? So all that information is given in a flowchart. So flowchart is a graphical representation, and it allows the give me a second. It allows the internal auditor to understand the process. If you flowchart a process, it allows the internal auditor to understand a series of activities and also to identify what internal controls are there and be able to analyze whether sufficient internal controls are there in that process. So flowcharting is not only about documenting a process, it's also about mapping a process. It's also about mapping the controls and seeing whether an improvement needs to be made. Flowcharting is typically used in the preliminary survey. Before you start the audit, you're supposed to, the audit proper or the field work, do a kind of a reviewing of the SOPs, reviewing of the directions, the documents, previous audit reports, reviewing of processes and documenting. After you do that, only you prepare the audit plan, and then only you carry out your audit work. So that's why they call it a preliminary survey. Yes. The preliminary survey involves talking to people, getting an understanding of the company, getting an understanding of the industry in which the company is operating, interviewing people, identifying the operations of the company, product services itself, geographies it operates in, what sort of SOPs do they have, reviewing the SOPs, previous internal audit reports, external audit reports, studying processes, flow charting it, and then documenting it, completing checklists related to internal controls. Once you do that, only you go to the next stage of carrying out the audit. So flowchart also uses various symbols. These can be asked in exam, especially the top 4, 5 you have to remember. First one is end, start or end, the document one. That is the second one. Then the rectangular box, right, which shows a compute operator, automated process. Then the box where the two sides are leading inwards, that shows it's a manual process. If a PO is raised through the system, it's a third symbol from the top. If the PO is raised manual, it's the fourth symbol from the top. Then you have the generalized symbol for input output, the media. So just be familiar with these symbols. Then the decision symbol at the end, the hard drive symbol, the decision symbol. Can you see this diamond shaped thing at the bottom? That's like you say, if the amount is above 50,000, then it will be approved by the manager. If it's below 50,000, it will be approved by the system account. So wherever a decision needs to be made, kind of if scenario, then you have to use that symbol. So those are some of the symbols you need to keep in mind here. There are symbols here also, but these are not very, very important. But remember that at least these symbols are the first slide. Then there are two types of flowcharts, horizontal flowcharts and vertical flowcharts. So vertical flowcharts is what we usually draw, right? Where we start at the top and then goes down. Then you see all these boxes which are there on slide 2. It shows all the successive steps. It shows the information flow, you know. So vertical flowcharts is that. Now, apart from vertical flowcharts, you call vertical flowcharts program charts also. Then you have horizontal flowcharts. Horizontal flowcharts, another name is system flowcharts. So if you see, for example, I will show you a flowchart where you see the departments at the top and then the process cutting across various departments. That will be horizontal flowchart. So a horizontal flowchart basically shows the departments at the top. So maybe the process or something like purchase order, maybe it starts initially, requisition comes from the user department. Then it goes to inventory department. Then it goes to procurement department. So when you look at the top you see the department as like columns. And in each department at the bottom, you have the processes that take place in that department. So that sort of chart is called horizontal flow chart. So if you see a flow chart where it starts at the top and ends at the bottom, that will be a vertical flow chart. But if you see a flow chart where they kind of cut across various departments, right, where the process moves from left to right, and at the top you get the names of the departments. Then you see how the process cuts across various departments. You have vertical, then that would be a horizontal flowchart. And other name is system flowchart. Just remember that, in case they ask you at the exam. So horizontal flowchart, another name is system flowchart. Vertical flowchart, another name is program flowchart. Flowcharts top to bottom would be vertical, left to right would be horizontal. Best way to distinguish between the two is to, if you see the name of the department at the top, several names of several departments, then that would be a horizontal flowchart. Data flow diagram is a diagram where you see how the data flows in a system, right? Data flow diagram is different from a flow chart, because a data flow diagram basically shows how data flows in a system, you know. So when you want to see how data flows in a system, the 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 diagram is a data flow diagram, maps out the flow of information in a process or a system. There again, more or less the same symbols are used. So they might not show you, if you see a diagram where they kind of show how the data flows, then that would be a data flow diagram, right? Just go to Google and you can type. I will just show you a diagram. Just give me a second. If you get an MCQ where you're asked, what is the diagram that shows the flow of data in a system or process, that would be a data flow diagram, right? Can you see this diagram on the screen? It just shows how data flows, you know. Just shows how data flows. So logical DFTs, physical DFTs. What is a data flow diagram? Data flow diagram is a visual representation of the information flow through a process or through a system. DFDs help you better understand process or system operations, discover potential problems. You just know that it shows the information flow uh, in a system. So you also need to know what is a pie chart, that you know, right? These are pie charts. I hope you can see it on the screen, right? Then you know what bar charts are. These are bar charts. Then what else? Let's quickly go to the, yeah. Then there was another chart, pie chart, bar chart, line charts. These are these line charts, right? They may ask you at the exams line charts. Can you see? All right, so let's move back to our presentation. Internal controls, right? So now it's 7:30, we'll have a 2-minute break, okay? All right. So it says here, we are going to learn a little bit about accounting cycles and associated controls. A properly designed system of internal control should reduce the risk of errors. Obviously, so you have internal controls in place in an organization, not only to prevent fraud or detect fraud, you have internal controls to prevent and detect errors also, which are unintentional mistakes, right? The structure of an organization and the assignment of job duty should be designed to segregate certain functions. That's where, of course, subject to cost-benefit analysis, you can't just recommend that every key task be segregated among several employees. You have to look at the cost-benefit of it and what is the loss that could occur, and if the benefit outweighs the cost only, you can certainly recommend segregation of duties. I can remember in a certain company where we said that there's a lack of segregation of duties, which required an additional SAP license to be procured. And management was not too keen on getting that SAP license. But one of the senior people said, the last cost of a SAP license may be about 50,000, 60,000 a year. I think that investment should be made. And looking at the frauds, the risk of fraud or risk of error that could occur if they had not got it. And the duty is segregated. It couldn't be segregated because there was only one license. So if you have two licenses, then the task would be segregated between two employees. So always the cost benefit has to be considered, not only in lack of segregation of duties, but also in when you recommend processes, right? You make recommendations and give it little thought. So segregation of duties is about the person who raises a document or a transaction, the person who checks it, authorizes it, disburses it, the custodian of the document, all should be segregated. So if I'm raising the purchase order, if I'm raising a journal entry, another person should check it, the third person should authorize it, the fourth person should be the custodian of it, and if it's like a payroll, the disbursement should be handled by a fifth person. So you can't segregate all these tasks. Sometimes you might not have a person who checks it, one person raises, one person approves. Maybe the payroll is prepared by A, approved by B, and finance department disburses it. There is, to a certain extent, segregation among departments. So you think about it. Ideally, it needs to be segregated. But if you want to really study segregations, you can Google. If it's SAP, you just Google SAP segregation SOD, then there are templates that are being used. You can follow. Okay, the problem is internal controls. When you have an internal control, if there is collusion, then the internal control is rendered. Even if you have segregation of duties and you have good controls, the control is rendered useless, redundant if there is collusion. People get together and commit a fraud. That's where you have to be a little careful. And then you have management override. Management override is a situation where, given the power and authority of management, they can instruct staff to carry out certain tasks, right? It's the ability of management or the directors to manipulate accounts, to carry out frauds by bypassing internal controls. Controls operating well, but you can, because of their power and authority, they can bypass certain controls, they can override controls. Right? That is management override. And we need to why some of the frauds occur in the first place is due to management override. It is a situation where the management simply overrides a control or says it's not important. That leads to a fraud. The reasons why frauds have occurred is due to that. So whenever we do an internal audit, we have to see what are the possibilities of management overriding controls. Sometimes occurs in financial statement fraud. It's also a type of fraud. I mean, you had asset misappropriation fraud and bribery and corruption fraud, but The reasons that financial statement fraud occurs is due to management override. Right? These controls can be well designed, they can be effective. But if they can be overridden by management, then of course effectiveness of that internal control is lost. It's like the management saying, career braces journal entry, you know, and they themselves can sometimes approve it. They can follow the control, but they perform a fraudulent act even if they follow the control, where they just can just override it. So in a company, there are various, when you're doing an audit, you have to also look at the organizational structure. If you're doing a purchase procurement audit, okay, what is the structure in the procurement department? How responsibilities assigned? What do the reporting lines look like? How many staff do they have? Do they have more staff, less staff? Are there vacancies? All that you have to look at. Because sometimes it's a department, so it's not structured properly. Wrong people are reporting to the incorrect, inappropriate supervisors, staffing. There is an issue. There are a lot of vacancies. The allocation of responsibilities is not right. So, as an internal auditor, you are now expected to comment on that also. You can have the best controls in place. But if the wrong people are performing them, so there is an issue with supervision or lack of supervision or lack of reporting, where some people are not getting supervised at all, or some of their tasks are not being properly reviewed periodically. Because frauds also get detected due to supervision, due to superiors reviewing certain documents or reconciliations of their subordinates or delegates, or those to whom tasks have been delegated to. So you have to look at all that and then decide whether you need to make any recommendations on that. So you need to get the departmental structure, the job descriptions, the allocation of responsibilities, the reporting lines, the vacancies against cadre. That you may have to give a comment on that in your report. So when you look at the cycles, you have procure to pay from the point a purchase order is placed to payment. That is one cycle. Then you have order to cash. From the time a customer places an order, the raising of the invoice, receiving it, it's converted to cash. That's the accounts receivable side. Procure to pay is accounts payable side. Of course, here you have collection of cash from customer receivables. Also, that is also 1 and 2 are more accounts receivable. 3 is procure to pay. 4 is also procure to pay, and 5th is about payroll, right? Payroll processes. So accounts receivable, accounts payable, and payroll. So 3 key cycles. Apart from this, of course, you have the inventory cycle also. Management, the chief audit. So what are their roles? In a company, you have the management, you have board of directors, you have internal auditors, and you have other auditors, other personnel. So when you're going to do an internal audit, you have to convey to the management that it is their responsibility to ensure that proper internal controls are there. Their responsibility. When a fraud occurs, it is not the internal auditor's problem. It is the management. Management is responsible. If you have a procurement head, the procurement head is responsible for ensuring that there are proper internal controls in their department to safeguard assets, to comply with laws and regulations, to ensure the integrity of their reports, to prevent and detect fraud. That is their responsibility. So you have to communicate this to them. It's not the internal auditor who comes once a year or does audits periodically. Of course, the internal auditor should comment on any internal control weaknesses and rectify it and get it rectified. It's a different matter. The auditor's role is to help. The CEO has a responsibility to establish the tone at the top. Organizations reflect the ethical values and control consciousness of the CEO. Ethical values and control consciousness. Can you see that? There has to be a code of ethics. The CEO has to come out and say, internal controls are important. There's zero tolerance for fraud. Recommendations by the internal auditor should be immediately rectified. Non-compliances with controls or whatever will be taken seriously. Disciplinary action will follow. This is our code of ethics. These are our key values that his behavior must reflect that. Chief accounting officer would be the CFO, has also a crucial role to play, because the CFO is like the second line of defense. CFO sees everything. All the funds movements happens through the CFO. So they play a very important role in the second line of defense. Of course, they play a role in the first line of defense when it comes to financial reporting and all that. But when it comes to authorizing payments or credit notes or whatever, they are in the second line to some extent, right? Because they see transactions which originate from other departments. So when it comes for payment approval, they can control it. They can prevent the payment from being processed without sufficient documents in place, right? Or lack of source documents. So CFO also has a very important role, and all heads of departments are responsible as perform the first line of controls, or to ensure that the first line of controls are operating effectively. Board of directors must be committed to the code of ethics, code of conduct. They must periodically review those policies, right? They must approve those policies in the first place. Implementation, the board of directors has a role in overseeing the implementation of policies. They don't actually go and implement, but they must occasionally, at audit committee meetings, talk about the importance of integrity and ethical values. And they must play a part in selections for KMPs, key management personnel in the division. They must play a part in that recruitment. Effective board members should be capable of objective judgment, have knowledge of the organization's industry, and you see, as the board of directors, the board will approve policies and procedures. It's up to the management to ensure that they are implemented. But the board needs to ensure or to ask the management have some sort of process in place to see whether those policies and procedures are being implemented. That's where the internal auditor comes in. The internal auditor is the place, does the spade work, right? It helps the board directors to discharge their responsibilities. So it's the internal auditor's reports. Through those reports, assurance is obtained. One way is through the external auditor, one way is through the internal auditor. There are other mechanisms also you can have through quality departments, through what you call level 2 monitoring, where the management itself carries out through the compliance officer, through risk departments. Those also sources of assurance through maybe through the regulator audits, health and safety audits, environmental audits. So there are various ways in which the board of directors gets its assurance, right? So compliance departments also play a very important role in giving that assurance to the board that the board does not on their own do any audits. So they get through their reports only. So they have to oversee. Can't just approve a policy and procedure and look the other way. You have to get comfort that those policies and procedures are being effectively implemented and those controls are working properly. Even on the fraud risk assessments, the boards have to get some sort of comfort that a fraud risk assessment is done. The management has put in place proper controls. They're operating effectively. That discussion must take place at an audit. Important subcommittees. So that's where you have audit, remuneration, nomination, related party transactions. All of those committees play a role in internal. The remuneration committee will set remuneration policies, ensure that employees are properly paid, they are not incentivized to commit fraud. The nomination committee will ensure that those people who are nominated for senior positions or for board directorships are people at the highest level of integrity and ethics. There are proper job specifications. Similarly, they will assess the performance of key people. Risk committee also looks at all the risks, the management of risks and all that. So the board as well as the subcommittees have or play key roles in ensuring that the risks of the governance of the organization, the risk management of the organization, and the controls of the organization are at an acceptable level, right? So the board has a role in terms of oversees the implementation of policies and procedures. It oversees the level, the internal control structure. It oversees, right? It doesn't implement. So management establishes the tone of the talk. The directors also must also, in a way, the chairman of the audit, a very important role in ensuring that proper tone is maintained. Internal auditor's responsibility now is the key part. What is your responsibility? But this management is responsible for the design and function of internal control. It's a management that is responsible. You see, we just help assist to maintain an efficient internal control structure. The internal auditor evaluates, can you see, evaluates the system of internal controls. We evaluate the system of internal controls. We help to improve the effectiveness of internal controls. We help. So we evaluate, we recommend, we help, we assist, but we don't do. We don't draft, we don't decide, we don't implement. To remain independent, the internal auditor cannot accept management function. So we do not draft. If we draft a control or draft SOP, we are performing a management function. If we design a control, we perform a management function. But what we do is we help with the designing of, through recommending. It's a different matter. It's more of a consulting advisory role that we play when we do an internal audit. It's not only assurance that we provide, it's a mix, it's a hybrid. In certain cases, we provide assurance that the control is working, but in certain cases, we make recommendations to improve internal controls. That's the advisory role. So both things happen, but we can't, though we give how it should be designed, the internal control, it's up to the management to accept that or implement that or anything else. So we can't design, we can't draft, we can't implement. We can only recommend and review. That's it. So if the management does not implement any of the internal controls, that's not the internal auditor's fault. It's the management's fault. You have to decide. Everyone in the entity must be involved in internal control. That is, every person more or less performs some activity. Knowingly or unknowingly, they are performing some internal control. So they must be aware as to why they are performing it. Sometimes they do perform internal control, but they don't know why they are doing it, the importance of it. Right? So that's very important. So the concept of imposed internal control and self-control, nothing much to talk about. You can read it at leisure. What that basically means is that certain internal controls are imposed. It's like it's coming from the outside, right? Where is that now? Right. Certain controls, it's like someone else telling you what to do. So it's imposed from outside. Self-control is a situation where you control yourself, right? Where there is self-restraint. You can't control everything, no? That's where, like, you have a code of ethics and you kind of control it. You restrain yourself, right? Rather than you being controlled from outside. So that is the principle. Just get that into your head. Self-control is like you exercise restraint for your own actions. And imposed control is something where it's control is imposed from outside. And then it's a matter of, complying with it. When it's self-control, it's within and you convince yourself you don't have to do it. Right? So just keep that in mind. Internal control, what is an internal control? According to Sawyer is considered the godfather of internal audit. There is a manual that he has published. He's the godfather of internal audit. He wrote about internal audits and internal controls and all that. A lot of literature put out by him. So what is an internal control? Can you read what's on the slide? Hmm. See, the forms of internal policies, implementing policies, putting in a proper organizational structure, putting in systems, policies, procedures, instructions, circulars, standards, forming various committees, having a chart of accounts, having forecasting, budgeting, preparing schedules, reports, checklists, methods, even internal auditing is also a control, right? So all these are kind of elements of control. No? An organization controls, directs, restrains, governs, and checks upon its various activities through these means. Internal auditing is also a tool of is a type of control. It's an internal audit also. What we go and do is check control. You know? It's a control over controls. So at the end of the day, controls are there to ensure that objectives are met. So the overarching at the exam, you might be asked, what is the goal of internal control? The overarching aim of an internal control is fulfillment of objectives, is achieving objectives. Because anything that prevents a company from achieving its objectives are called risks or threats. A risk is anything that prevents a company from achieving its objectives. So you have objectives, you have risks. Controls are there to control the risks. So if you can control the risks or mitigate the risks, chances of the company achieving its objectives are greater. That's where controls come in. So when we do an internal audit, we are checking the adequacy and effectiveness of controls. So controls, not any control, but controls linked to a risk, right? Every time we talk about a control, we have to see what is the risk. That's why in our reports, we always have this impact or implication or whatever. But the control must always be linked to a risk. And that risk must be always linked to an objective. Right? Earlier, when we used to do internal audits, those days we just went into a company and would ask the company what are the controls you have, and then did a kind of a check to see whether those controls are working. Now, when you go, you can't start with the controls. You have to ask the company what are your objectives. Then you have to study what the risks are. Then only you see whether the controls in place are sufficient or not. Right? That is very, very important. The organizational structure here, we discussed this a little bit. So the organization means, you structure the roles, responsibilities, the allocation of jobs and all that. It has to be done in a way where it's easier, economical and efficiently you can achieve the objectives. Responsibility should be divided so that no one person will control all phases of a transaction. That is called segregation of duties. That's why when you do an internal audit or you study a process, you have to always look at the segregation of duties. Right? Managers should have the authority to take action necessary to discharge their responsibility. That is about delegated authority levels. Everything cannot be controlled by the center or by the boss. To a certain extent, responsibilities have to be kind of trickled down, It has to be delegated. So what are the delegated Are they good enough? Should they be? Are they sufficient, or is too much power authority delegated? Right? Individual responsibility always should be clearly defined. That is about ensuring that the person knows their responsibility. That's one word, job description. The employees have proper job descriptions where they are aware of their responsibilities. Sometimes when things happen, they don't know what their responsibilities are. There is a practice. There is nothing documented. That's why you need to have SOPs and job description. SOP is also not good enough sometimes if the responsibilities are not properly documented. The best is to document, give everyone a job description where the responsibilities are clearly stated. Right? Individual should be clearly defined. An official who is that's this is number 3 is about accountability. Sometimes when frauds happen, no one is accountable, then we have an issue. An official who assigns responsibility, delegates authorities about should have an effective system of follow-up. That's about supervision. Number 4. Delegation is okay, but you have to see how is if there's someone doing some banking of funds, who is supervising that? If someone is taking money to the bank, who is supervising that? If a journal entry is being raised, who is checking and supervising that? So you can delegate. You can say, okay, everything has been delegated. The CFO can say everything I have delegated to the financial controller, but he also must have some sort of a mechanism through which he finds out whether that person has overstepped his boundaries. Right? So this monitoring is very important. How do you supervise? Everything cannot be delegated. The individuals, right. So number 5 is also that supervision. People should be required. So there must be exception reports generated, just to see whether everything is happening in line, reviewing of reconciliations, right? People should be required to count their superiors in the manner in which they have discharged their responsibility. Yeah, so through discussions, meetings, what they carry out, can be done. Organization should be flexible enough to permit changes in structure. That is where policies, procedures, the structures have to change with the times. Sometimes people change, systems change, IT systems change, external environment change. So all these things forces the organization also to be flexible and adaptable. So the organization's plans, policies, procedures, objectives also must change in alignment with the changes that are taking place in the company's environment. So be flexible, be adaptable. Organized structure should be as simple as possible. They are not too complicated. Obvious. That is where they say, here you're looking at a department in a company, but if you study the entire organizational structure, you have to see how the departments have been formulated, whether it's the allocation of activities based on function, who is reporting to whom. Sometimes you wouldn't want to place inventory under the CFO, it might come under the supply chain division. So the structuring of functions, which function is reporting to whom, how is the allocation taking place, that also you might have to comment on. You have to study about it first. Then you have to ensure that the organization has SOPs and manuals, right? And whether those manuals clearly document the activities, the approvals required, the documentation aspects very clearly. If you have manuals only, you can standardize the process, right? Policies. When we say, a company should have good policies, a good structure. In the earlier slide, we said company should have a good structure. Can you see organization, structure? All these things must be considered when you're doing an audit. Then it must have policies. One of the most important internal controls are implemented mainly through structures, policies, and procedures. Structures, policies, and procedures. So policies, you see, it's just is any stated principle. It's at a very high level. Policy generally talks about what should be done, why, not how. The steps are given in a procedure. It's like having a BCP policy and a BCP plan. The BCP policy will say the company should have a BCP plan. The BCP plan should be reviewed quarterly. It's at a policy level, 3 pages. The procedure will have how to develop the BCP and plan itself. Procedure will give you the step-by-step procedure that has to be followed. So policies go at macro level. Policy should be clearly stated in writing, systematically manual. So generally, procedure is in a manual and a handbook. Policies also, they say, should be ideally bound together so that at any given point, or sometimes when we go to do internal audit, policies are not in one place. Some policies are some with the finance manager, some policies are with someone else. First thing that you must do when you do an audit is, you must tell, can we have all the policies in one place? Put a contents page. Get it into one book. You have a BCP policy, BCP communication policy, BCP management policy, BCP this. On BCP itself, there are about 6-7 policies. Get it into one place. Then only you can see. Policy should be systematically communicated. There are communication of the policy. When you go to do an audit, you ask, now, do you all have a policy or a procedure? You ask someone, can you give it to me? If they can't retrieve it in 5 minutes, that means there is an issue. Right? They must know where the policy and procedure is. Of course, ones that are applicable to them. If they can't find it in 5 minutes, then problem. If they can't tell for sure whether there is, then you can get some sort of idea about the communication of the policies. Sometimes we feel like fools sometimes when we put in audit reports saying, we had a discussion with the accounts executive and although there's a policy and procedure, she was not aware of the contents of the policy, or she was unable to give us a copy of the policy. When you say that, the management laughs. That's exactly the way to see whether it's been properly communicated, whether the awareness levels of the policy are at a good level, When frauds occur, one of the reasons why frauds occur, they are not aware of the policy and procedure. So it looks like a stupid observation that you put based on a discussion with a low-level employee, but that's the ground reality. Policies must conform with applicable laws and regulations. So if they have policies and all, just see whether there are any deficiencies or areas or gaps in the policy. Because policy means, you have to look at every aspect. Policies generally ensure that it's a, what do you call it, environmental policy. It must ensure that the environmental aspects are covered in that. Policies should be designed to promote the conduct of authorized activities in an effective, efficient way. Yeah, obviously, policies should be periodically reviewed, at least annual basis. Every policy should be reviewed. At least the audit committee must say we reviewed the policies and there are revisions or there are no revisions, but the review must take place. Right? Procedures are methods employed to carry out activities. That is how a process or activity should be carried out step by step. That is important. Can you see? Procedures should be periodically reviewed like policies. Procedures should not be overlapping, conflict, or duplicative. Procedures should promote efficiency and economy. Non-mechanical operations should be automated as much as possible. Routine ones can be automated. Procedures should prevent fraud and error. No? So these are some of the things. This is, of course, involves reviewing a policy, reviewing an SOP. When you're reviewing SOP also, what is said in the SOP is the most effective, efficient, economical way of doing it. Efficient and economy is you carry out a process with the least, economy is least inputs in terms of material, labor, and cost. Efficiency means maximum output for a given input. Economy means least input, least cost way of doing things. Effectiveness, of course, is linked to achievement of objectives. So when you're leaving a procedure manual also, you have to think of all these things. Think of efficiency, economy, duplications, lack of segregation of duties, overlapping, conflicting, that is segregation of duties, prevention of controls for prevention of frauds and errors, people, their designations. Can you see all? Some of this is theoretical, but behind all these words, there's something to be learned, you know. Can you see so detailed as to stifle the use of judgment? That is, it's too rule-based. But then again, a procedure, you have to clearly enumerate, you know, what steps need to be followed, but not too, you know, must leave a little bit of leeway or room for what you call leave a little discretion for the person to act a little independently, of course, within certain parameters. You delegate some responsibility. You know. Personnel who is hired. One of the reasons why controls don't work well is that you have the wrong people doing the wrong jobs. That's why you need to have job specifications and ensure that people are hired according to those, promoted according to those. Performance is appraised according to certain KPIs. New employee should be investigated as to honesty and reliability. That is a reference check. Sometimes as auditors, we put reference check is not carried out. I can remember once I did a fraud audit in a company. About 6 months later, I get another call from a company and they describe the fraud that has taken place. And I just asked who to see that earlier fellow, same fellow. Who got a promotion and gone to another company. And second company had not carried out a fraud of reference check. They had done it, they would have caught this fellow and not recruited him in the first place. Employed about the training, can you see training needs analysis? So they are properly trained. Employees should be given information on the duties and responsibilities of other segments of the organization. That is about job rotation and job enrichment. Performance appraisals, where their performance is. So what recruitment policies do they have? Promotion policies, onboarding policies, training policies, performance appraisals, right? All those job descriptions, all those need to be looked at. Accounting, of course, is about, you know, the financial records, the management aspects, the control. So each department has its own cost. No? So any department that you audit, you have to see what reports that they generate from the system to control that department. It can be management reports from SAP, Oracle. It can be reports from the financial systems. There are reports that they generate to control the activities of that department. How are they generated? Are they sufficient? Are the formats okay? The information complete? The integrity of those reports, the timeliness in preparation, all that you have to look at. Budgeting is also very important. Budgetary controls. Now, every department has to have some KPI, some budget, actual versus budget. The chart of accounts also must reflect the budget. Right? Budget must be incorporated in the financial system. All that is important. What are the budgets that the management KPIs that have been set? What are your KPI achievements? Why haven't you achieved your KPIs? All that. How do they set their budgets? Reporting. So the other side of it is reporting is the management account. You see, reports should be timely. Report recipient should be polled periodically. It is whoever who is receiving a report must talk to them and see, do you make use of these reports? How can we improve those reports? Reports should be, there should be exemption reports also, exception reports to identify anomalies. So what exception reports do you generate from this? It could be journal entries raised outside of office hours, journal entries raised on POA days, exception reports. When appropriate, performance reports should show comparisons, that is, actual versus budgeted variance. Report should be simple, consistent, simple, not be too complicated. The cost of accumulating data and preparing reports should be weighed against the benefits. That's why you look at the reporting efficiency. That is, how difficult or easy is it to compile the report. Some reports to prepare, it takes about 3 days. So then can you recommend that it be done from the system? Can you implement a software system to prepare it more efficiently? The cost of preparing the report efficiency of report preparation. What reports do you all prepare on Excel? What reports do you all, how long does it take to prepare those Excel-based reports? Why cannot it be automated? And then each person, what are the reports that they use? Are they sufficient for them? Are there reports that they would like to have, which they cannot get at the moment to better perform their responsibilities? Reports should be linked to their responsibilities. If you have a manager, I don't think everyone at a very low level will have a report, but you have to see what are do you use any reports, generate any reports? Does the manager generate any reports? It's true, reports that at the end of the day, the managers control or monitor operations under them. All right, I think that's about it. Right, so there are a few charts here that I can later on share. So now we have come to the last 2 units. There is a unit on risk management where we learn about risk management frameworks and how to manage risks. Then there is another unit on control types and frameworks. So 4 more theory classes, and then we are done. So under control frameworks, we learn about COSO framework, preventive controls, detective controls, compensatory controls, complementary controls, IT general controls, application controls, people-based controls, system-based controls, so many types of controls. COSO framework, COBIT framework, it's a vast module. Here are slides. Then we have to talk about risk management. That falling as the definition of terms, and then 2 models, the COSO ERM framework and the ISO 31000 ERM framework. Interesting stuff. Do you all have any questions? We'll start those 2 modules next week. Next week, there's going to be a bit of an issue for me. On the 6th, I'm unable to do the class. That is next Friday, and 13th also. 13th, I can do. Sorry, today's Thursday, no? Sorry. 5th, I can't do. That is next Thursday. I have a wedding. And then 12th, also, I have a Christmas party that I have to attend. We'll do one of the boards. 5 and 12, I cannot do. 26th is Christmas. So 24th week, there will be nothing. So 19th I can do. So 19th can. The next 2 weeks, bit of a problem. So I will suggest a few dates. Few dates, or I will put in the WhatsApp group. We'll try to see how we can catch up those 2 classes, at least 2-3 classes in December. So 19th can do, 26th there won't be any classes because that's the Christmas week. Before the 19th, the 5th and the 12th Thursday, I'm unable to do because of 2 family functions. So alternatively, we'll try to have it on 2 other days. Maybe 16th Monday or 9th. Anyway, I'll let you know. I'll keep you posted. I'll put it on the WhatsApp group, and then if majority can do, we will go ahead. Yeah. But anyway, there are recordings for those who miss. There's no issue, but only thing is you don't get the opportunity to ask questions. So do you have any questions you'd like to ask me now on what we've done? Start revising if you're planning to do the exams, because we have target in January, or Feb, because after May, it's a new syllabus. No problem. New questions and all that. So now there is no change to the database at all. This thing is to quickly pass at least part one. Get it over and done. We'll stop for today and then later on decide when we should have the next class. Any questions? No? All right. So thank you for joining today's class. We'll meet up soon. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Ashwin. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.